Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. As you all know, my name is Adrienne Lipscomb. I'm going to let people come in, but as you are coming in, please let us know where you are in the chat. I'm from Austin, Texas. I'll let y'all know that, but I have ties to the Midwest, so I'm super, super excited about Audrey's presentation today. Let me pull some stuff up. All
I'm
right, guys. We're just going to ask everybody to stay on mute as you come into the room. And I also would love to tell y'all as for slow food, we do depend on y'all's membership. So please, 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 if you are not a member, I believe Robin can put up the link. I may be asking her to do something out of the blue,
No,
to
I can
join
do it.
slow food. So today I have the pleasure of introducing Audrey Tran Lam, who is doing a study out of the University of North Iowa at the Center of Energy and Environmental Education, over Iowa's food system. We were introduced through the executive director of Slow Food through Chris Reed, and we had this amazing deep thought conversation, and this was just an opportunity to bring her in to tell us about a food system that she has been studying and how it really does affect the larger scan and the larger scene of nutrition and food in the United States. So I am going to pass it to Audrey to tell us a little bit about herself and to show us a great presentation. Thank you, Audrey.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation, the opportunity to talk with you all. Very, very curious about where you're all calling in from. And I see at least a couple Midwesterners here, or Midwesterners at heart. So thanks for tuning in. And I really hope that we can have a cool discussion about what's going on in the Midwest, and what does this food system look like, and how does it impact how we think about um, food, land use, human health, and all of those things swirl together. So, like Adrienne said, my name is Audrey Tran. I serve as the Environmental Health Program Director at the University of Northern Iowa Center for Energy and Environmental Education. Um, and I have a really, really unique role at the center where I get to dip my toe into topics like farming practices and land use. My background is in public health, so I think about the human health implications of these activities on our landscape. I'm also pretty involved in thinking through issues like how agricultural petrochemicals impact climate change as well as human health, and really try to help to articulate the connections between and among all of these intermingling issues. I do a lot of communication with public health professionals about how, what's going on here in our region is impactful downstream to our local communities. And I do a lot of, I guess you would call capacity building among partners. Sort of, I am someone who can fill gaps when it comes to these issues and move this collective work forward. So again, really, really happy for to be here and for being able to share some of our, I guess, our landscape with you all. Let me move us forward here. I feel like every time is the first time. All right, next slide here. So the outline of my talk looks like this. I'm going to give you a brief introduction, sort of just like a snapshot of the landscape and why it is that I love Iowa so much. We'll go over what I am sort of cheekily calling a landscape analysis. I'll sort of give you another snapshot of how the land is used and what agricultural productivity looks like in Iowa, and sort of as an analogy to the broader Midwest. We'll talk about, I would argue, one of the most like proximal issues to public health with regards to land use and downstream impacts. And we'll probably briefly, because I'm a bit of a yapper, probably briefly be able to talk about solutions. What can and is being done on some parcels to ameliorate some of the, I would say, negative harms of a system that looks like the one that we have here. And then we'll wrap up and hopefully have time for a nice discussion, and to listen to questions and to talk about this stuff. So welcome to Iowa. Welcome to Iowa. This is my home. I was born and raised here. I love this place so much. I took this photo on my way back from a public health conference back in 2019, and I give kind of a disclaimer when I show this slide in any presentation that it works its way into, that I did not have the foresight when I took this photo that I was going to be using it in my public talks in my career. I didn't take this picture thinking, oh yeah, this is really going to work in that Slow Foods USA presentation that I'm definitely going to give at one point in my life. No, I took this picture because I think it's so beautiful. I really do love this landscape. And I feel like a lot of Midwesterners, a lot of Iowans have this kind of nostalgic like relationship with our patchwork quilt landscape. However, those of us who work in food systems or environmental health or sustainable agricultural practices, we have this kind of, we look at this with the nostalgia, but also knowing that there's a lot of baggage, right? A lot of baggage with how a landscape that looks like this, pretty much river to river, looks. Couple of pieces of context that I think are useful to have in the back of your mind as I'm giving this presentation is one, 95% of the table food that Iowans eat comes from elsewhere. We're not growing the food that we are consuming here. For 3 years in a row, Iowa has been #2 in cancer incidence. So what that means is that we have some of the highest new cancer cases in the entire United States, one of the fastest growing cancer rates in the entire nation. And I think that these two pieces of information, like where our food is coming from and sort of the health status, the chronic health status of many Iowans, are really important things to, I guess the word is contextualize land use, economic activities surrounding how people, where people live, work, and play. Let's move us forward. So let's talk about the land use. What's it look like? And this is my little landscape analysis section. So many of you probably know this, especially you Midwesterners, is that Iowa, the Midwest, has some of the most fertile soils in the world. It's really, really incredible. And that has to do with the historic tallgrass prairie that covered our landscape prior to it being settled, the landscape being settled. Less than 0.1% of that prairie remains is sort of the going estimate. And so this deep, deep black earth that we have sort of been blessed with is due to that those deep root systems that tallgrass prairie that tallgrass prairie left. Because all of this prairie was tilled under, Iowa also has a claim to fame of being one of the most transformed landscapes in the world. So instead of our about like 86% of the land in Iowa being tallgrass prairie, it is now farmed, right? Agricultural activity has the footprint of 85% of our land. That's 30 and almost 500,000 acres in some kind of form of agricultural productivity. We are #1 in the nation for corn production, for ethanol production, for hog production, for eggs. We are #2 in soy. Sometimes if Illinois slacks off, we steal that #1 spot, but they rarely slack off. And we are #4 in feeder cattle. And feeder cattle are the cattle that are grown to sort of support other herds. So we grow sort of the babies that go to other herds to build them up. Now, in order for this kind of a system of intense productivity to work, we rely a lot on genetically modified crops. So about 95% of the corn in Iowa is genetically modified and 98% of the soy. So that genetic modification, it primarily makes them resistant to one or more herbicides. So it makes them tolerant to herbicide use. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a little bit. Almost 1% of Iowa farms are organic. We rank 6th in the nation for organic production. And I'm pretty sure that almost 1% puts us just below the national average for organic production. A couple things that I like to mention about this, this product level of productivity is that this hogs number, right? This number one in hogs. If you think about sort of the national output of hogs, 1/3 of them is coming from our little state. 1/3 of the hogs in the nation are produced in Iowa. It's mind blowing. It's mind blowing. There's about 3.5 million people, like a people population in Iowa, but anywhere, in the year we could have up to 24 million hogs. So we're quite outnumbered by the amount of animals in the state. The corn number two is something that I want to talk about because we're number one in the nation for corn production, and a lot of pride comes from agricultural productivity in Iowa because there's a lot of narrative swirling around about both sustainability and how we're feeding the world. And it's true that this amount of corn bushels provides pretty much the caloric requirements for every man, woman, and child in the United States, right? But these corn calories are inaccessible to people to eat without being processed or sort of filtered through an animal. And we're really not sort of putting this feed corn to use exclusively for animal feed, though almost half of the corn that we grow here goes to animal feed. Most of it now is going to ethanol production. And I think that those are pretty much the major highlights of, or sort of like the inside baseball on some of these big numbers. So I'm going to move us on to sort of maps, some visuals to sort of pick apart what this productivity looks like on the ground. The first picture that I have to show is the one that's on the left. I put a little box around Iowa right here for those of you who maybe are Midwesterners at heart, but have maybe forgotten the difference between Ohio, Idaho, and Iowa. We're right in the heartland. This is the Corn Belt. But this picture does not show corn. This one is showing the concentration of confined animal feeding operations across the nation. So this is all animal production in every state. Iowa, it's giving ground zero, right? It's like very concentrated right here. This picture, maybe counterintuitively now until I sort of explain it, has a lot to do with the second picture, the one on the right side of the screen. This is a survey of Wright County, so one of our 99 counties in Iowa, that shows sort of the diversity of land use in crops. So it strikes you immediately as being very colorful, lots going on, right? But if we look carefully at the legend, we'll find that there's only really like one of two things being grown on any of these parcels. So this survey was a 6-year survey taken between 2010 and 2016. And if that seems dated to you, you're not wrong. But nothing in the landscape has really changed in Iowa. So I do not feel weird at all about using this as an example to illustrate sort of how these animal and corn and soy crops intermingle. So just to break it down for you all, there's the first item on the legend here is continuous corn, which means that throughout this 6-year survey, only corn was planted on those yellow parcels. Majority corn is this sort of light peachy color, really cute. Maybe 5 or 6 years through the survey, corn was planted there, and then it would have been rotated into a different crop the next year. The orange is a corn-soy rotation, which means, maybe 2010 it was in corn, 2011 it was in soy, 2012 it was back in corn. So it just sort of alternates between the two. And the green colors is exactly the same. It's just flipped the alternation. So instead of corn in 2010, those parcels would have been soy. 2011 corn, 2012 back to soy. So when we zoom out and actually look at what the legend's telling us, one of two things is happening on the landscape in Iowa for the majority of the time. And this is what this landscape looks like. Now, I mentioned before in my last slide that a lot of the destination for these grain crops is going into animal agriculture. And so a lot of times we'll hear some narratives about sustainability when it comes to sort of what land use and animal production looks like in the state. Like, oh, we're growing corn, the corn feeds the hogs, and then the hogs' manure fertilizes the corn. It's circular, it's very sustainable. Unfortunately, that narrative really doesn't go very, very deep into what's occurring on our landscape. There are so many agrochemical inputs that are required to maintain a system that lacks biodiversity. So like this corn soy rotation. So in order to grow corn on corn on corn, or corn followed by soy followed by corn, it requires a lot of synthetic fertilizer, a lot of pesticides, which we'll all sort of get into here in a little bit. Hopefully this helps to illustrate the concentration and I guess lack of diversity that our land what our landscape looks like. So what I want to get into next are the inputs required to make a system like this. My goodness, I was about to say flourish, but I'm not exactly sure that's the word that I want to use. To make a system like this go, you need a lot of these synthetic inputs. So let's break that down. What kind of inputs are we talking about here? Um, One of the most important nutrients for a corn crop to use is nitrogen. And this can come from manure from animals. And we do apply the most manure onto our fields than any other state. We apply manure to 2.5 million acres of our land. But the rest of that land has synthetic nitrogen applied onto it. So on average, 150 pounds or so-ish are applied to almost all, 95% of our acreage every year. And this may be in addition to that manure. So some of these acres are kind of getting double applied through different nitrogen sources. We also apply a lot of phosphorus, but that's roughly about 75% of our acres. And I don't know the application rate. I'm realizing right now, but that's something that I could look up for you all if you were interested in knowing more about that. We also apply 53 million pounds of herbicides annually. Every year, 53 million pounds of herbicides gets applied to our landscape, to those genetically modified corn and bean crops. Really important thing to note about that massive figure, though, is that it does not capture the scale of chemical application, right? That figure only refers to herbicides, not insecticides or fungicides. It also doesn't take into account any of the other or they used to call them inactive ingredients, right? The synergists, the surfactants, the things that help the active ingredient apply or adhere to the plant for better uptake so it can better do its job. We're finding, however, though, like independent scientists are finding that some of these like inactive, again, quotes around inactive ingredients do have some, hormonal disruption qualities about them. So we're finding that these are hormonally disruptive chemicals. Some of them contain PFAS. Some of the active ingredients are PFAS. Those forever chemicals that we're finding are kind of nasty to both the environment and human health. So it's quite a problem, this chemical soup issue that sort of Midwesterners in places that use a lot of pesticides in agriculture are facing. The other sneaky problem with using this volume and type of pesticide in a concentrated area year after year after year is that pests become resistant. And this is both for insects and for weeds. So weed resistance is becoming a really significant problem for farmers to try to combat. Their tools, the tools in the tool belt for them, if they're continuing to grow genetically modified crops, is to spray a larger volume of pesticides or sort of do additional passes, or to spray combinations of chemicals. Maybe some of those are older chemistries that might be more harmful to human health, but we're running out of tools because the active ingredients, we're not developing more active ingredients in different types of herbicides every year to combat this rising pest pressure. This rising pest pressure really is a problem with lack of diversity. We see a lot of pest suppression benefits when we improve the amount of diversity that's on the landscape, or plant certain things that have these allelopathic or weed suppressing qualities about them. So my main interest area is in pesticides and public health. So this is the slide that we could go deep on, but I also want to get to some more of these other human health, public health considerations. I mentioned before that water quality is kind of that, like, it's the most close topic to the hearts of public health professionals, and especially in Iowa right now. And this has to do with both pesticide pollution, but more importantly, nitrate pollution. Just a little bit of background to understand the water quality conversation is that the Safe Drinking Water Act has these sort of these thresholds for certain contaminants in our public drinking water systems. It applies, the Safe Drinking Water Act applies to everybody on a public drinking water service. So a municipality, a city, anybody who's treating your water and it comes out your tap, that is sort of overseen by the Safe Drinking Water Act to make sure that we aren't, there aren't contaminants that can harm the population in them. It does not apply, however, to private well owners. So if you are a rural household and you have a well that supplies all of your drinking, cooking, cleaning water, that is not regulated, and that's on the well owner to manage, to test and to remediate if necessary. So in Iowa, almost 10%, roughly 9% of Iowans are on a private well. They rely on private wells for their drinking water, but only 5 to 7% of those private wells are tested regularly. So we have a relatively large percentage of our rural population that doesn't really have a good sense of what's going on with their drinking water. Now, I want to talk about nitrates in particular because sort of that's where we've had a lot of really, I would say, welcome attention on pollution, nitrate pollution in Iowa's drinking water in the last, I would say, probably growing in the last 5 years, but especially this year in 2025. So the EPA has set a maximum contaminant level of 10 parts per million for nitrates. Right. So if a public drinking water system is getting close to or is at about to exceed 10 parts per million, they need to treat the water so it remains under 10 parts. And that was set, by the way, to prevent from acute health harms, especially for pregnant women and for infants that are bottle fed. Infants could be sort of afflicted with this potentially fatal issue called methemoglobinemia or blue baby syndrome, where the nitrates in the formula from the well water or from the tap water that had too much nitrates in it would really interfere with the oxygen transport in their body, and they would slowly acquire this bluish tint to them as they were sort of their blood was kind of suffocating, and it, like I said, can be potentially fatal. So this 10 parts per million MCL was set to prevent that, to prevent blue baby syndrome. However, in sort of the last, I would say like 10, 15 years, we have acquired this wealth of scientific literature that has shown that there's a lot of other acute, so the lower than the 10 parts per million level that we're seeing chronic health impacts, including cancers. So colorectal cancers, some thyroid issues, ovarian and kidney cancers, some not so great things. We also know that there's a lot of emerging evidence on birth impacts. So ingestion of water with high amounts of nitrates in it can lead to preterm birth or low birth weight. And when I say high levels of nitrates, I'm talking about sort of these acute issues, but also sort of lower, maybe like 5 parts per million or less of this nitrate contamination. So it doesn't have to be very, very high for it to be causing these long-term, maybe long latency diseases. And we are starting to be able to wrap our heads around epidemiologically that there are issues with mixtures of certain compounds. So nitrates and the herbicide atrazine, for example, may be doing more harm when a person is exposed to those compounds together than they are in isolation. This nitrate issue does pose a disproportionate impact to small and rural communities that can't afford these large nitrate removal systems like the one that we find in central Iowa, for example. Central Iowa has I think one of the biggest, at one point, the biggest nitrate removal system in the world. It's a very, very expensive piece of equipment to operate, but it has had to be used because the nitrates in the Des Moines and Raccoon River get so high that that we need to sort of peel these nitrates off to keep it at 10 parts per million. Small communities in Iowa cannot afford a multi-million-dollar nitrate removal system. Iowans who have a well in their backyard cannot afford some of these extremely expensive interventions to have clean water, which some may argue is a basic human right. Now, there are even further downstream impacts to water quality that impact communities far beyond Iowa. Now, Iowa's footprint is it's tiny, right? It makes up of less than 5% of the Mississippi River watershed. And so this picture that I got on the screen here, it's one of my favorite pictures ever. It's from NASA and it shows the outline of the Mississippi River basin, all of the rivers and tributaries that lead down to the Delta, right? Um, we have a tiny footprint, right? Less than 5% of Iowa's land footprint makes up this watershed, but we contribute almost a third of the nitrate to the Delta, right? Almost a third. Like a mind-boggling amount of nutrients wash away off of our land down the river, down the Mississippi. So Iowans really are not the only ones who are paying the price for this cheap food and cheap fuel system that we have in the Midwest and in the Corn Belt. We know that for a very long time, there have been major economic consequences to nutrients suffocating the life in the waters of the Louisiana Delta. And what that means for the fishermen and for the people down there who rely on marine life for their livelihood. So really, really, I think important to think much beyond the borders of our state in the Midwest. And we also have this terrible phosphorus loss problem when we lose our soil. So, like I said very, very early on in the talk, soil is one of the most important resources to Iowa, right? Some of the biggest fertility gains that we have comes from just the medium in which our crops are grown. And when we plant crops the way that we do, very, very limited cover cropping, corn with very, very shallow root systems, soil in the spring when it rains very heavily, usually, is very easily washed away down our rivers. And so this is a picture of a sheet erosion episode where you can see sort of the tons and tons of soil that leave a field sort of every spring. Now, just because of the way that phosphorus, the compound is charged, it likes to bind to soil. And so when I see soil loss, I just think phosphorus loss. And phosphorus, also a nutrient, really impacts sort of the water quality, water eutrophications in the bodies of water that we have in our state. So we have very few places to recreate in Iowa. Because our streams and our rivers and our lakes are so heavily polluted with nutrients that we have these toxic algal blooms that sort of take things over. Let me pause here before I move into solutions just to do a quick pulse check. Any questions or clarification needed? How are we doing?
I think we're doing good. I think a lot of us are probably in shock.
I'm so sorry. I'm giving you a lot of things to think about here. I'm so
It's it's
sorry.
it's awesome, because like again, I lived in the Midwest and I lived in La Crosse, and we have granddad's Bluff. So I could see like four different states from that area, and Iowa was one of them that we could see. And understanding the agriculture of what that area brings and how it affects other areas, even down to Louisiana. And I think we don't realize the impact, and especially with the grandeur of the Mississippi River and what is happening with our soil and what is going to our waters, and how it's not just affecting our state, but also affecting other areas as well as an impact. When you said, I think you said 90% of your food is brought into.
Upwards of, yeah.
Yeah, upwards of 90. So where I am at in Austin, Texas, 99.6% of our produce is brought in as well, which is kind of mind-boggling, right? And y'all are agriculture, so I'm just kind of blown away. And we're not agriculture, we're tech. So, and I'm still blown away by those numbers. And it makes me quite nervous because the products that you're talking about, a lot of them are commodities, right? So they're like your soy, your corn, and the rotation of those. And I'm like, well, what are you eating? Which is absolutely none of those, right? And and I'm y'all, if y'all have questions, please ask because my mind is like wheeling and turning. But
I
but and also about the hogs, right? So I do know about about the hog produce that's coming out of there. I'm just kind of shocked. I think I don't know if anybody else is, but I'm just kind of shocked on the level of, what we're the impact that we're doing to the soil, to the land, but also the lack of agriculture that's for us, for the people.
Mhm. Right, right. A lot of questions that I ask. So if I talk to a student group or if I, give a similar presentation to a professional group, a lot of the questions that I ask revolve around, the like who is this ultimately in service, of, like who does this activity serve? I'm not quite sure we can confidently say that what's going on here serves Iowans, or
Right.
serves the people on the land or who work on the land. There is sort of just the, thinking about the lack of agricultural production of specialty crops, or food that people can eat. It puts a lot of pressure, like a ton of pressure on the places that do produce these crops for people to eat, right? And it strains the food system in a lot of ways. There's not a lot of redundancy if something goes wrong. So, for example, if all of your eggs or the majority of your eggs are coming from states like Iowa, right? Because we are, again, the number one producer of eggs. What happens to egg prices if sort of a bird flu wipes through the
Right.
country, right? And there are a culling of all of these laying hens. Like, what does that mean for egg prices? What does that mean for a system that has really vertically integrated so many of these production supply chain steps for when things do go wrong, right? There
Right.
isn't that diversity of marketplaces. There isn't that competition that lends itself to being a more resilient food system nationally.
Yeah.
So it's sometimes difficult, if you don't live in Iowa or the Midwest, to see what this looks like every day and sort of don't, think about what corn ethanol means for you in your life. So this is sort of it. Like um, the lack, right? It does impact national economics. It does impact national food system shocks when things like
Right.
this happen, national disasters. So I think that this is kind of a nice primer to understand that this region plays a really important role, but not the role that you would sort of think, not this sort of breadbasket of the world, feeding the world kind of mentality. It's very different with severe consequences.
Well, I also am like, like I said, my wheels are turning and I'm thinking about sustainability. Like, I don't see the sustainability of this, and especially if I bring it back to farmers, right? So if our farmers are like, averaging the age of, it has gone down. I think it's 58. It used to be 65 or something in the
Mhm.
number. It's like, who's going to take over for these farmers? And then economically, the farmers themselves, how much in funding are they making, or can they even live off of this as well, especially the way
Mhm.
that our politics are going today, in this world. But let alone, this is like separating, even talking about just agriculturally and environmentally, what's happening to the soil, what's happening to the water, because we
Right.
can't continue doing what we're doing, because it's going to fail, especially the monocultural aspect, and the animals as well. It's like it's the bubble's going to burst, and unfortunately, I'm sorry, I'm like going down a dark
I
road
know.
with this, and I'm like just learning, and I'm like, wait, this. There's a tipping point, and there's going to be a tipping point,
Mhm.
and I don't see a bailing system coming out in this process to alleviate our soil, to alleviate the animal process, nor the commodities at this moment.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know what's happening with farmers at this moment, especially with the tariffs, because I'm assuming a lot of this product was also being shipped out. So it wasn't directly for the United States or for here.
No, not all of it stayed here. We had a huge export market for a lot of these
Mm,
commodity grains, right? So it would go to sort of feed herds around the world, or to directly impact food supplies. So, for example, China was a huge purchaser of, like, one of our, I guess, largest customers for our soybeans. But that evaporated, that completely dried up when the tariffs went into place. And so trying to find a new market for the soy crop, right, which we produce quite a lot, in the Midwest? Like where does it go? Where does it go next? Like what markets exist to divert from a country that was sort of the a reliable place for these returns to come from, or a reliable market for this crop to go? Yeah, so it's a very I think probably uncertain is kind of a light word to use. There's a lot of uncertainty about farming in the current system and what it means in if we have to keep these things domestically, like what happens to the markets. The I like to point out that there sometimes is a lot of, when you start to get down into these environmental externalities, like these human health impacts, these climate impacts of farming in this intensified petrochemically based system, there sometimes comes up a lot of conversations of like environmentalists against farmers, like why don't
Mm,
you just change the system? Like why don't you do it differently? You're poisoning our communities, and I think that that's such a harmful. That is a very poisonous narrative, because many farmers are sort of at the whim of major federal policy decisions
right,
that incentivize certain farming practices over
right.
others, and sort of gives no wiggle room or incentives to do sort of any conservation practices or incorporate diversity onto the landscape, or sort of do these upstream land use solutions that would solve for these patterns of cascading environmental health impacts. So we have to keep this in mind, that what is being reflected on the landscape in the Midwest sort of is a reflection of policy right now, and what policy has been for a very, very long time. So in some ways, where there are farmers absolutely who are implementing sort of better practices on the land that have made huge differences to water quality, soil health, sort of their economic bottom line, reducing the amount of herbicides and pesticides used in a system. Definitely those farmers out there. But it is a risky transition for them to take, given sort of the economics that are tied into a lot of these the policy landscape, should I say?
Well, I want to thank you for that because that was going to be my next, like, where do we go and how do we make this better? And it's
Well, I have
not
good news.
okay, okay, good. Because I
Let
was
me
going to
give
be
you the good
like,
news.
because again, and I do really appreciate you bringing up about how farmers are in this. They're in this kind of like pinch, right? A lot of it does depend on federal policies that are coming down in support of, ownership of their land. Some of
Mhm.
them are sharecroppers, some of them, are just trying to make sure that they can still own their land, and
Absolutely.
and a lot of that does depend on, subsidies from the government and depending on what they grow or what they don't grow or if they're
Mhm.
told not to grow. So that, that really does depend. And I think, unfortunately, the way that our agricultural system was built historically has really affected what is happening to our earth today. But I want to hear good news. So
Yes,
I'm sorry. I like you took a break and I am so happy because I had 1,000 questions.
no, that's really good, because it's good to get all of that out of your system before you sort of clear the air for some sort of positive things.
Yeah.
Right. And I want to, this is the thing that like sort of helps me get out of bed in the morning, right? If you sort of look at the system as being hopeless and impossible, then like it's a very, very gloomy, it's a gloomy situation. But if you know about the sort of agronomic sort of replicated trials that show that an alternative system is possible, that requires much fewer inputs, that sort of improves the economic bottom line for farmers, then suddenly, like a world of possibility opens up for you. So I
Right.
want to talk about that. Like I want to talk about one of the main solutions that exists for Iowa farmers and farmers in the Midwest is more diversity. More diversity, please. We find that when we incorporate biodiversity on the land, we see huge benefits to soil health. We see huge benefits to increased organic matter, which improves the water holding capacity of soils, which both makes them both drought resistant and sort of a more able to sort of absorb water after major rain or flooding events. So it's like it's a very cool thing that happens when you increase the soil organic matter. You also have these suppressing effects that I mentioned sort of much earlier in the talk, right? All of these things come in a system that is more welcoming of biodiversity. So let me talk specifically about some of these studies and what they've found. So way back when I showed you that snapshot, that cross section of Wright County in Iowa that showed the lack of biodiversity on the land, that was really showing a 2-year cropping system, right? Excluding, of course, the continuous corn or the majority corn parcels. These long-term farming trails from Iowa, by the way, and other places, but some of these, the most amazing results have come from Iowa, shows that this increasing length of a farming system, so like from a 2-year rotation to a 3 or 4 year rotation has significant impacts to the amount of synthetic inputs that are required. So it reduces them quite significantly. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, sort of what the like a term cropping rotation means, I think it looks pretty visually intuitive when you see it laid out like this. So in the like in a year one, like a 2-year cropping rotation, year one would be sort of corn on this part of the parcel and soy on the other. Year two, it would flip. A 3-year rotation takes an additional year to complete. So it would reduce the amount of corn and soy on the land, but it would incorporate a different crop. So in this example, we would say have corn in one parcel, soy in the next one, and then oats or some small grain in this last one. Year two, everything would shift over. So soy, then oats, then corn. And then year three, the rotation would complete and you would have oats, corn, and then soy. And a 4-year rotation, you would throw something else in. So in this case, it would be maybe corn, soy, oats, and alfalfa, or some other, legume. So researchers found that in this 3-year rotation, there was an 88 reduction in nitrogen applied, synthetic nitrogen applied, and almost 100%, so 96% reduction in herbicides applied in this rotation. And that we saw even more reductions in the 4-year rotation. So increasing diversity on the land is looking good for reduction of synthetic inputs, which have a pretty significant petrochemical footprint, right? So it's also important for climate change purposes that we sort of move away from these synthetic inputs. This solution here is one that's pretty scalable to Iowa and in a place that sort of has this commodity market where we have these large grain elevators, where we have sort of the capacity to grow the volume of crops that we do, right? This is a little bit more appropriate than moving everything immediately over to specialty crops, right? Because we have sort of that infrastructure. But I wouldn't say that this picture is the entire solution, but it's a really important one. So like what's stopping us from moving into a system that has more biodiversity in it, right? And one of those things is markets. Like, what are we gonna do with all those oats? What are we gonna do with all that rye or that triticale? Like, where's the alfalfa going? Like, how do we make this work? Right? If all of our animals are eating corn, then what are we gonna do with that alfalfa? Right? Where can we sell? What's the market for it? There's also this, oh, I should say about markets too. So I live in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where we have a Quaker Oats factory, right? Oats are shipped in by rail to this factory for processing. Most of the oats comes from up north, right? Mostly Canada. If our farmers decided to start growing a ton of oats, there's really no way for them to get those oats to like local processing plants because that sort of agreement is worked out. Like these oats come from Canada and places that are set up to work with this rail system to get these oats there. So it's not an easy switch. Like if we decided to grow a ton of oats, there's not immediately a way for it to be processed locally. And there's also this initial risk that I sort of briefly mentioned earlier, right? We have now a soil medium that has been fairly depleted, right? And so you are going to have to do quite a lot of remediation to maybe support productive, diverse landscapes. It might be difficult to find a lender to approve farm loans if they see that you are maybe trying something different and aren't going with a tried and true method, right? There will be a time of reduced income. And if you are switching over to some of these crops that maybe don't have a very robust insurance system, those failures might equate to a reduced income. And of course, there's a learning curve to growing something new. There is some greenwashing and marketing that goes into our current system, right? For it to sort of seem palatable and for us to kind of go along with the status quo, right? One of those things was the narrative around farming and pride and how corn grows Iowa, corn grows the Midwest, we feed the world, all of that stuff. But there's also conflict of interest. Because we have so much GM seed grown in our fields, the same companies that are selling the seeds that are genetically modified to be paired with a particular active ingredient are also selling your chemicals. So there are seed and chemical bundles, which feels like a major conflict of interest when it comes to trying to find non-GM seeds or grow anything organically or with reduced inputs. The chemical regulatory process in the United States is lacking. And that is probably like, that's a euphemism for it's not a good one and it doesn't really work. So there's this perception of chemical safety, right? If you can buy it off the shelf, it's probably safe. It's been vetted. We don't expect any, major or chronic health harms. Unfortunately, that's not entirely the case. And we can spend sort of another hour together talking about why that is. And then there are claims about circular or sustainable farming, kind of like the one that I shared with you much earlier about how manure grows corn, corn feeds pigs. It's a circle, it's sustainable, right? And clearly that's not the case. So there's a lot of inertia that's needed to overcome some of the stories that we tell ourselves about the farming system in order to sort of break open our imaginations to what is possible and to think like, okay, how can we get more small grain processing on the landscape? How do we encourage motivate farmers to grow maybe specialty crops or food that people can eat um, without or sort of in anticipation of growing that actual infrastructure out, right? What does vegetable processing look like in the Midwest? What do plants that can freeze or flash freeze a bunch of vegetables looks like? Like that's the kind of landscape that we also need to be thinking about here, the commercial landscape that can accept and process these different foods. So my take home message is that we need more diversity on the land. We need to be growing more food for people, of course. This may mean that farms shrink in size a little bit, and it probably means that we'll need more farmers on the landscape doing the work. Um, just to wrap things up, like for real this time, we'll wrap things up. To share a little bit of my work, I do a lot of outreach about these topics, about how these strategies are already being implemented on the landscape, highlighting farmers that are farming this way, implementing conservation practices and diversity. So we sort of support these on-farm field day events with partners, Practical Farmers of Iowa, of course, being just sort of like an incredible organization that are showing just sort of the variety of different farming practices and how it can be all made possible just by helping encourage getting people on the landscape to see how things can be different. And then I also, of course, do a ton of outreach to my colleagues in public health about how these issues are pretty central to Midwestern public health impacts and how we need to be using our sort of expertise, our credentials, our knowledge to think about maybe policy change, think about how to encourage food system change that will benefit those that live sort of in the proximity of this activity. So that's my talk. I know it was pretty overwhelming, especially if these are new issues for you all to sort of digest. But hopefully that leaves things off on a maybe more positive note that change is possible out there, very, very well researched, very, very well understood how we can sort of make these soil health impacts that can ultimately sort of, help us heal, I guess, from the ground up. Thank you so much.
Well, Audrey, first of all, I want to thank you so much for this information. And I do want to open this up. So if you do have a question, please do enter it into the chat and we will ask. For me, I'm so happy you talked about diversity and the need of diversity. And it's easier said than done, right? Like we can
Mhm.
say, farmer, hey, why don't you grow watermelons? And why don't you grow this? But it's also like the aspect of where does it go? How does it get processed? And there's a longer chain that's needed. As you know, a lot of the people that are listening today, they're part of this chapter and they're just finding out about this or they're living with us. How can we get more involved in this information? How can we help talk more about this information to our chapters or to just, our regular neighbor?
Yeah, oh, that's such a good question. Every state will kind of have a different, at least in my sort of assessment, every state kind of has a similar version of what's going on in Iowa, right? We have these industrialized processes or industrialized agricultural systems that may or may not be harmful to your communities. And so I think that like understanding the local impacts of the food system and how it actually looks in your area is really, I think that's a good entry point, right? Also knowing what it is that you like to eat and figuring out where it comes from I think is part of this like personal journey to being able to be an effective advocate for something different. Of course, eating local, finding your farmers that you know where your food is coming from is really important because um, supporting them sort of reduces your own input, reduces your own footprint in this larger system where we talked about sort of being concentrated maybe on the coasts or different parts of the country. So sort of sourcing as locally as possible is definitely a part of the solution. Some of this other work happens in policy, right?
Yeah.
So I think that like it's a very hard and tedious thing to ask of people, but understanding the policy landscape that makes something like this possible also I think helps with the I don't know, it kind of helps with the rage aspect of it. I think you need to be a little annoyed that this is the way that the system is in order to be a really good advocate. So I think that those are starting points, right? And I think that if you feel comfortable with it, talking to elected officials about what this means for the people on the ground is also a really, really important thing. The cancer conversation in Iowa is a platform right now that we are using to talk about these broader environmental health issues. These are incredibly relevant to Iowans right now, and likely they are important issues to you all wherever you're based. So
Yeah.
that would be my advice.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw the question. Is this, it says, is it, I guess it's same to assume that the higher level of nitrates, 10% will contribute to other cancers, or safe to
Mm,
assume? Hmm.
yeah. So I come from a very like precautionary principle worldview, right? It's like we don't need to have all of the answers in order to be taking action that we know is beneficial. For a topic like nitrates, like an issue like nitrates, the burden of proof really shouldn't be on people to prove that they are getting sick from this contaminant in our waterways. It's really on industry to prove that this amount of contaminant is safe to be in the drinking water system, right? Which of course that's not going to happen. There is, of course, plenty of evidence linking nitrates at that subchronic 10 parts per million level to cancer outcomes, right? And I mentioned them before, like thyroid, ovarian, kidney, colon, right? We have evidence that these things are linked to chronic long latency period outcomes. It is completely unethical to conduct these long-term randomized control trials with these environmental contaminants that we know are harmful to people in both acute and subacute doses. So we can't go out there and get that like causative evidence that people crave in order to make like policy decisions because we're not going to dose half a population with high levels or subchronic levels of nitrates and
Right.
compare them to a drinking water population that has clean drinking water, right? We can't do that kind of studies. That's yeah, unethical. So we need to rely on the evidence that's out there based on populations, based on the epidemiology. And those things are pointing us in the direction that this is harmful. We really shouldn't be ingesting it at the levels that we are ingesting it, especially these sort of more vulnerable groups like infants, like pregnant women, etc.
So I'm gonna, something just crossed my mind, and because I don't think you've said it, but we are hearing this very often, regenerative farming. Do you hear that happening, or conversation with farmers, or it being brought up, in policy in Iowa?
No, I don't think specifically in Iowa, so policy conversations. There are definitely people in Iowa talking about like regenerative farming practices. I feel like there's maybe at least I don't have a clear definition of what regenerative can mean, right? Because I think that there is a spectrum of regeneration that can
Yeah.
occur based on different farming practices. I think it would be really important to have a universal definition of what that means in order to move it forward on a political stage. And especially since some sort of regenerative farmers who are like, for example, not organic, sort of claim that regenerative label. And some people, especially sort of in the organic farming world, see that as being very problematic. Um, and so we have these I wouldn't say discrepancies or disagreements, but we have these things to work out with that term. But I am all in favor of improving soil health, right? Increasing soil biodiversity, increasing organic matter water holding capacity, right? In order to preserve this medium that we need for a healthy farming system, right? It was a great question. I feel like that was
I
an unsatisfying answer, but I tried hard.
No, it was really a trick question because I loved your answer because it is a frustrating word because it's such a buzzword and in regenerative it doesn't have a really refined defined definition of exactly what fits that category. And I love that you answer it this way. Like unfortunately, fortunately, the Texas Ag, our Texas Ag helped create the organic tag.
Mm,
And as you can tell, the organic tag was supposed to start, the sticker was supposed to be for good, like identification, but it became more economically a value of like, if you have this tag, you'll be able to charge more for your food, right? And so there is this push to make a regenerative tag, and it's not well defined. And I have really push that conversation because like who gets to define what's regenerative, right? And plus from what we're describing what it is, people have been doing it eons, like eons ago.
right.
And like how do you define who's regenerative or not, and does it become a money grab issue that's ending up kind of come with that? So a question
Mm.
that was asked was, how would we help policymakers to make better decisions about diversity of our food and to support local farmers? Can you speak about current lobbyist groups that are doing this?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't think I can speak to the lobbyist part of that question. The sort of my gut reaction to that, the first part of that question is to sort of remove the influence of industry on sort of elections and sort of political influence, right? There is a lot of influence that commercial agricultural groups and industry have in politics with contributions or having dedicated lobbyists in Capitol buildings, for example, that sort of a local diversified farming system does not have the capacity, the support, the funding to do to like mirror or match. So I think that we need as a society, right, to think a little bit more maybe critically about money in politics. That sort of gets like way beyond the my slideshow, right? And unfortunately, like completely, I don't know, complicates a larger conversation about food systems. But I do feel like it's pretty related, and it may solve a lot of other problems as well in terms of decision making and policy sort of engagement on this issue. I think that, again, using an Iowa example, really anchoring food system issues in human health outcomes, as well as sort of like these environmental externalities, has been really beneficial in us being able to get loud about what's going on here. And I think that getting loud about it is the beginning of making sort of political changes. Being a state university employee, I am not, a part of these policy conversations, but I have seen that this is sort of the tactic that our activists or sort of our groups that are on the ground and able to be more politically active are taking.
As not a university
Yeah.
professor or student, but also as an advocate, unfortunately, especially within our turmoil of politics right now, I've found myself going a lot more hyper local and working on a more local aspect of conversation, because I can tell you, people on the federal levels, they're looking for precedents of change. And usually a lot of that precedence of change happens more on a local level. And then they're like, okay, we see this area is doing this. How did they make it happen? And that was a lot of what was happening with me. Like I was getting phone calls from like the White House or USDA, and I'm going, whoa, like they're seeing changes, but they're like, how did you do it? So, even going on your local level, if you have a food policy board, usually that's an advisory board
Mm.
that that is recommended and nominated, and they're regular people in the community that care about your food, from chefs to farmers, just to people who are in the food scene or gardeners as well. So definitely, I would look up your food policy board on a hyper level. I mean, if you're gung ho and you want to hit organizations and ask them about their lobbyists, yeah, definitely contact, your food banks, the National Farming Association, the Young Youth Farming Association. there's so many, and they do have lobbyists, and they do take people through lived experiences to go lobby and talk to people up there. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunities, and maybe that's maybe a future conversation that we find somebody that will talk to us about that. But we have hit 12 o'clock, and Robin is going to keep me on that. I know that was so fast. And
That was really
Audrey,
quick.
I would love it, thank you so, so much for taking the time to talk to us about Iowa and the bigger scope of the impact and what it does within the United States.
Absolutely. I again really tickled by the invite, and I'm taking the comment about bringing solutions up close earlier in the presentation to heart. I really appreciate that feedback. Thank you all for being such a great audience and for the nice discussion afterwards. I appreciate it.
All right, guys, if you do love these lunch and learns, please, please, please become a member of Slow Food USA. We love bringing them, and we're hoping and excited about what's coming up in the next couple months, and especially for 2026.